Chapter 1. Effectiveness can be learned. To be effective is the job of the executive. To effect and to execute are, after all, near synonyms. Whether he works in a business or in a hospital, in a government agency or in a labor union, in a university or in the army, the executive is first of all expected to get the right things done, and this is simply that he is expected to be effective. Yet men of high effectiveness are conspicuous by their absence in executive jobs. High intelligence is common enough among executives, imagination is far from rare, the level of knowledge tends to be high, but there seems to be little correlation between a man's effectiveness and his intelligence, his imagination, or his knowledge. Brilliant men are often strikingly ineffectual. They fail to realize that the brilliant insight isn't by itself achievement. They never have learned that insights become effectiveness only through hard systematic work. Conversely, in every organization there are some highly effective plotters. While others rush around in the frenzy and busyness which very bright people so often confuse with creativity, the plotter puts one foot in front of the other and gets there first, like the tortoise in the old fable. Intelligence, imagination, and knowledge are essential resources, but only effectiveness converts them into results. By themselves, they only set limits to what can be attained. Why we need effective executives. All this should be obvious, but why then has so little attention been paid to effectiveness in an age in which there are mountains of books and articles on every other aspect of the executive's tasks? One reason for this neglect is that effectiveness is the specific technology of the knowledge worker within an organization. Until recently, there was no more than a handful of these around. For manual work, we need only efficiency, that is, the ability to do things right rather than the ability to get the right things done. The manual worker can always be judged in terms of the quantity and quality of a definable and discrete output, such as a pair of shoes. We've learned how to measure efficiency and how to define quality in manual work during the last 100 years, to the point where we've been able to multiply the output of the individual worker tremendously. Formerly, the manual worker, whether machine operator or frontline soldier, predominated in all organizations. Few people of effectiveness were needed, those at the top who gave the orders that others carried out. They were so small a fraction of the total work population that we could, rightly or wrongly, take their effectiveness for granted. We could depend on the supply of naturals, the few people in any area of human endeavor who somehow know what the rest of us have to learn the hard way. This was true not only of business and the army. It's hard to realize today that government during the American Civil War 100 years ago meant the merest handful of people. Lincoln's Secretary of War had fewer than 50 civilian subordinates, most of them not executives and policymakers but telegraph clerks. The entire Washington establishment of the U.S. government in Theodore Roosevelt's time, around 1900, could be comfortably housed in any one of the government buildings along the mall today. The hospital of yesterday did not know any of the health service professionals, the X-ray and lab technicians, the dietitians and therapists, the social workers, and so on, of whom it now employs as many as 250 for every 100 patients. Apart from a few nurses, there were only cleaning women, cooks, and maids. The physician was the knowledge worker, with the nurse as his aide. In other words, up to recent times, the major problem of organization was efficiency in the performance of the manual worker, who did what he had been told to do. Knowledge workers weren't predominant in organization. In fact, only a small fraction of the knowledge workers of earlier days were part of an organization. Most of them worked by themselves as professionals, at best with a clerk. Their effectiveness, or lack of effectiveness, concerned only themselves and affected only themselves. Today, however, the large knowledge organization is the central reality. Modern society is a society of large, organized institutions. In every one of them, including the armed services, the center of gravity has shifted to the knowledge worker, the man who puts to work what he has between his ears rather than the brawn of his muscles or the skill of his hands. Increasingly, the majority of people who have been schooled to use knowledge, theory, and concept rather than physical force or manual skill work in an organization and are effective insofar as they can make a contribution to the organization. Now effectiveness can no longer be taken for granted. Now it can no longer be neglected. The imposing system of measurements and tests which we've developed for manual work, from industrial engineering to quality control, isn't applicable to knowledge work. There are few things less pleasing to the Lord and less productive than an engineering department that rapidly turns out beautiful blueprints for the wrong product. Working on the right things is what makes knowledge work effective. This isn't capable of being measured by any of the yardsticks for manual work. The knowledge worker can't be supervised closely or in detail. He can only be helped, but he must direct himself, and he must direct himself toward performance and contribution, that is, toward effectiveness. A cartoon in the New Yorker magazine some time ago showed an office on the door of which was the legend, Chaz Smith, General Sales Manager, Ajax Soap Company. The walls were bare except for a big sign saying, Think. The man in the office had his feet propped up on his desk and was blowing smoke rings at the ceiling. Outside, 2 older men went by, the one saying to the other, But how can we be sure that Smith thinks soap? One can indeed never be sure what the knowledge worker thinks, and yet thinking is a specific work. It's his doing. The motivation of the knowledge worker depends on his being effective, on his being able to achieve. If effectiveness is lacking in his work, his commitment to work and to contribution will soon wither, and he'll become a time server going through the motions from 9 to 5. The knowledge worker doesn't produce something that is effective by itself. He doesn't produce a physical product, a ditch, a pair of shoes, a machine part. He produces knowledge, ideas, information. By themselves, these products are useless. Somebody else, another man of knowledge, has to take them as his input and convert them into his output before they have any reality. The greatest wisdom not applied to action and behavior is meaningless data. The knowledge worker, therefore, must do something which a manual worker need not do. He must provide effectiveness. He can't depend on the utility his output carries with it, as does a well-made pair of shoes. The knowledge worker is the one factor of production through which the highly developed societies and economies of today, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, and also increasingly the Soviet Union, become and remain competitive. This is particularly true of the United States. The only resource in respect to which America can possibly have a competitive advantage is education. American education may leave a good deal to be desired, but it is massive beyond anything poorer societies can afford, for education is the most expensive capital investment we have ever known. A PhD in the natural sciences represents $100,000 to $200,000 of social capital investment. Even the boy who graduates from college without any specific professional competence represents an investment of $50,000 or more. This only a very rich society can afford. Education is the one area, therefore, in which the richest of all societies, the United States, has a genuine advantage, provided it can make the knowledge worker productive, and productivity for the knowledge worker means the ability to get the right things done. It means effectiveness. Who is an executive? Every knowledge worker in modern organization is an executive if, by virtue of his position or knowledge, he's responsible for a contribution that materially affects the capacity of the organization to perform and to obtain results. This may be the capacity of a business to bring out a new product or to obtain a larger share of a given market. It may be the capacity of a hospital to provide bedside care to its patients, and so on. Such a man or woman must make decisions. He can't just carry out orders. He must take responsibility for his contribution, and he is supposed, by virtue of his knowledge, to be better equipped to make the right decision than anyone else. He may be overridden, he may be demoted or fired, but so long as he has the job, the goals, the standards, and the contribution are in his keeping. Most managers are executives, though not all, but many non-managers are also becoming executives in modern society, for the knowledge organization, as we've been learning these last few years, needs both managers and individual professional contributors in positions of responsibility, decision-making, and authority. This fact is perhaps best illustrated by a recent newspaper interview with a young American infantry captain in the Vietnam jungle. Asked by the reporter, "How in this confused situation can you retain command?" the young captain said, "Around here, I am the only guy who is responsible. If these men don't know what to do when they run into an enemy in the jungle, I'm too far away to tell them. My job is to make sure they know. What they do depends on the situation, which only they can judge. The responsibility is always mine, but the decision lies with whoever is on the spot." In a guerrilla war, every man is an executive. There are many managers who aren't executives. Many people, in other words, are superiors of other people, and often of fairly large numbers of other people, and still don't seriously affect the ability of the organization to perform. Most foremen in a manufacturing plant belong here. They're overseers in the literal sense of the word. They're managers in that they manage the work of others, but they have neither the responsibility for nor authority over the direction, the content, and the quality of the work or the methods of its performance. They can still be measured and appraised very largely in terms of efficiency and quality, and by the yardsticks we've developed to measure and appraise the work and performance of the manual worker. Conversely, whether a knowledge worker is an executive doesn't depend on whether he manages people or not. In one business, the market research man may have a staff of 200 people, whereas the market research man of the closest competitor is all by himself and has only a secretary for his staff. This should make little difference in the contribution expected of the two men. It's an administrative detail. And 200 people, of course, can do a great deal more work than one man, but it doesn't follow that they produce and contribute more. Knowledge work isn't defined by quantity. Neither is knowledge work defined by its costs. Knowledge work is defined by its results, and for these, the size of the group and the magnitude of the managerial job aren't even symptoms. Having many people working in market research may endow the results with that increment of insight, imagination, and quality that gives a company the potential of rapid growth and success. If so, 200 men are cheap, but it's just as likely that the manager will be overwhelmed by all the problems 200 men bring to their work and cause through their interactions. He may be so busy managing as to have no time for market research and for fundamental decisions. He may be so busy checking figures that he never asks the question, what do we really mean when we say our market? And as a result, he may fail to notice significant changes in the market, which eventually may cause the downfall of his company. But the individual market researcher without a staff may be equally productive or unproductive. He may be the source of the knowledge and vision that make his company prosper, or he may spend so much of his time hunting down details, the footnotes academicians so often mistake for research, as to see and hear nothing and to think even less. Throughout every one of our knowledge organizations, we have people who manage no one and yet are executives. Rarely indeed do we find a situation such as that in the Vietnam jungle, where at any moment, any member of the entire group may be called upon to make decisions with life and death impact for the whole. But the chemist in the research laboratory who decides to follow one line of inquiry rather than another one may make the entrepreneurial decision that determines the future of his company. He may be the research director, but he also may be, and often is, a chemist with no managerial responsibilities, if not even a fairly junior man. Similarly, the decision what to consider one product in the account books may be made by a senior vice president in the company. It may also be made by a junior, and this holds true in all areas of today's large organization. I have called executives those knowledge workers, managers, or individual professionals who are expected by virtue of their position or their knowledge to make decisions in the normal course of their work that have significant impact on the performance and results of the whole. They're by no means a majority of the knowledge workers, for in knowledge work too, as in all other areas, there's unskilled work and routine, but they are a much larger proportion of the total knowledge workforce than any organization chart ever reveals. This is beginning to be realized, as witness the many attempts to provide parallel ladders of recognition and reward for managers and for individual professional contributors. What few yet realize, however, is how many people there are even in the most humdrum organization of today, whether business or government agency, research lab or hospital, who have to make decisions of significant and irreversible impact. For the authority of knowledge is surely as legitimate as the authority of position. These decisions, moreover, are of the same kind as the decisions of top management. This was the main point Mr. Capel was making in the statement we just referred to. The most subordinate manager we now know may do the same kind of work as the president of the company or the administrator of the government agency, that is, plan, organize, integrate, motivate, and measure. His compass may be quite limited, but within his sphere, he's an executive. Similarly, every decision-maker does the same kind of work as the company president or the administrator. His scope may be quite limited, but he's an executive even if his function or his name appears neither on the organization chart nor in the internal telephone directory. And whether chief executive or beginner, he needs to be effective. Many of the examples used in this book are taken from the work and experience of chief executives in government, army, hospitals, business, and so on. The main reason is that these are accessible, are indeed often on the public record. Also, big things are more easily analyzed and seen than small ones. But this audiobook itself isn't an audiobook on what people at the top do or should do. It's addressed to everyone who, as a knowledge worker, is responsible for actions and decisions which are meant to contribute to the performance capacity of his organization. It's meant for every one of the men I call executives. Executive realities. The realities of the executive situation both demand effectiveness from him and make effectiveness exceedingly difficult to achieve. Indeed, unless executives work at becoming effective, the realities of their situation will push them into futility. Take a quick look at the realities of a knowledge worker outside an organization to see the problem. A physician has by and large no problem of effectiveness. The patient who walks into his office brings with him everything to make the physician's knowledge effective. During the time he's with the patient, the doctor can, as a rule, devote himself to the patient. He can keep interruptions to a minimum. The contribution the physician is expected to make is clear. What's important and what's not is determined by whatever ails the patient. The patient's complaints establish the doctor's priorities, and the goal, the objective, is given. It is to restore the patient to health, or at least to make him more comfortable. Physicians are not noted for their capacity to organize themselves and their work, but few of them have much trouble being effective. The executive in organization is in an entirely different position. In his situation, there are 4 major realities over which he has essentially no control. Every one of them is built into organization and into the executive's day and work. He has no choice but to cooperate with the inevitable, but every one of these realities exerts pressure toward non-results and non-performance. 1. The executive's time tends to belong to everybody else. If one attempted to define an executive operationally, that is, through his activities, one would have to define him as a captive of the organization. Everybody can move in on his time, and everybody does. There seems to be very little any one executive can do about it. He can't, as a rule, like the physician, stick his head out the door and say to the nurse, "I won't see anybody for the next half hour." Just at this moment, the executive's telephone rings, and he has to speak to the company's best customer or to a high official in the city administration or to his boss, and the next half hour is already gone. 2. Executives are forced to keep on operating unless they take positive action to change the reality in which they live and work. In the United States, the complaint is common that the company president, or any other senior officer, still continues to run marketing or the plant, even though he's now in charge of the whole business and should be giving his time to its direction. This is sometimes blamed on the fact that American executives graduate, as a rule, out of functional work and operations and can't slough off the habits of a lifetime when they get into general management, but exactly the same complaint can be heard in countries where the career ladder is quite different. In the Germanic countries, for instance, a common route into top management has been from a central secretariat, where one works all along as a generalist, yet in German, Swedish, or Dutch companies, top management people are criticized just as much for operating as in the United States. Nor, when one looks at organizations, is this tendency confined to the top. It pervades the entire executive group. There must be a reason for this tendency to operate other than career ladders or even the general perversity of human nature. The fundamental problem is the reality around the executive. Unless he changes it by deliberate action, the flow of events will determine what he's concerned with and what he does. Depending on the flow of events is appropriate for the physician, the doctor who looks up when a patient comes in and says, "Why are you here today?" expects the patient to tell him what's relevant. When the patient says, "Doctor, I can't sleep. I haven't been able to go to sleep the last 3 weeks," he's telling the doctor what the priority area is. Even if the doctor decides upon closer examination that the sleeplessness is a fairly minor symptom of a much more fundamental condition, he'll do something to help the patient to get a few good nights' rest. But events rarely tell the executive anything, let alone the real problem. For the doctor, the patient's complaint is central because it's central to the patient. The executive's concerned with a much more complex universe. What events are important and relevant and what events are merely distractions the events themselves don't indicate, they're not even symptoms in the sense in which the patient's narrative is a clue for the physician. If the executive lets the flow of events determine what he does, what he works on, and what he takes seriously, he'll fritter himself away operating. He may be an excellent man, but he's certain to waste his knowledge and ability and to throw away what little effectiveness he might have achieved. What the executive needs are criteria which enable him to work on the truly important, that is, on contributions and results, even though the criteria aren't found in the flow of events. 3. The third reality pushing the executive toward ineffectiveness is that he's within an organization. This means that he's effective only if and when other people make use of what he contributes. Organization is a means of multiplying the strength of an individual. It takes his knowledge and uses it as the resource, the motivation, and the vision of other knowledge workers. Knowledge workers are rarely in phase with each other precisely because they're knowledge workers. Each has his own skill and his own concerns. One man may be interested in tax accounting or in bacteriology or in training and developing tomorrow's key administrators in the city government, but the fellow next door is interested in the finer points of cost accounting and hospital economics or in the legalities of the city charter. Each has to be able to use what the other produces. Usually the people who are most important to the effectiveness of an executive aren't people over whom he has direct control. They're people in other areas, people who in terms of organization are sideways, or they're his superiors. Unless the executive can reach these people, can make his contribution effective for them and in their work, he has no effectiveness at all. 4. Finally, the executive is within an organization. Every executive, whether his organization is a business or a research laboratory, a government agency, a large university, or the Air Force, sees the inside, the organization, as close and immediate reality. He sees the outside only through thick and distorting lenses, if at all. What goes on outside is usually not even known firsthand. It's received through an organizational filter of reports, that is, in an already predigested and highly abstract form that imposes organizational criteria of relevance on the outside reality. But the organization is an abstraction. Mathematically, it would have to be represented as a point, that is, as having neither size nor extension. Even the largest organization is unreal compared to the reality of the environment in which it exists. Specifically, there are no results within the organization. All the results are on the outside. The only business results, for instance, are produced by a customer who converts the costs and efforts of the business into revenues and profits through his willingness to exchange his purchasing power for the products or services of the business. The customer may make his decisions as a consumer on the basis of market considerations of supply and demand, or as a socialist government which regulates supply and demand on the basis of essentially non-economic value preferences. In either case, the decision-maker is outside rather than inside the business. Similarly, a hospital has results only in respect to the patient, but the patient isn't a member of the hospital organization. For the patient, the hospital is real only while he stays there. His greatest desire is to go back to the non-hospital world as fast as possible. What happens inside any organization is effort and cost. To speak of profit centers in a business, as we are wont to do, is polite euphemism. There are only effort centers. The less an organization has to do to produce results, the better it does its job. That it takes 100,000 employees to produce the automobiles or the steel the market wants is essentially a gross engineering imperfection. The fewer people, the smaller, the less activity inside, the more nearly perfect is the organization in terms of its only reason for existence, the service to the environment. This outside, this environment which is the true reality, is well beyond effective control from the inside. At the most, results are codetermined, as for instance in warfare, where the outcome is the result of the actions and decisions of both armies. In a business, there can be attempts to mold the customer's preferences and values through promotion and advertising. Except in an extreme shortage situation such as a war economy, the customer still has the final word and the effective veto power, which explains why every communist economy has run into trouble as soon as it moved beyond extreme shortages and long before it reached a position of adequate market supply in which the customer, rather than the political authorities, makes the real and final decisions. But it's the inside of the organization that's most visible to the executive. It's the inside that has immediacy for him. Its relations and contacts, its problems and challenges, its cross-currents and gossip reach him and touch him at every point. Unless he makes special efforts to gain direct access to outside reality, he'll become increasingly inside-focused. The higher up in the organization he goes, the the more will his attention be drawn to problems and challenges of the inside rather than to events on the outside. An organization, a social artifact, is very different from a biological organism, yet it stands under the law that governs the structure and size of animals and plants. The surface goes up with the square of the radius, but the mass grows with the cube. The larger the animal becomes, the more resources have to be devoted to the mass and to the internal tasks, to circulation and information, to the nervous system, and so on. Every part of an amoeba is in constant, direct contact with the environment. It therefore needs no special organs to perceive its environment or to hold it together, but a large and complex animal such as man needs a skeleton to hold it together. It needs all kinds of specialized organs for ingestion and digestion, for respiration and exhalation, for carrying oxygen to the tissues, for reproduction, and so on. Above all, a man needs a brain and a number of complex nervous systems. Most of the mass of the amoeba is directly concerned with survival and procreation. Most of the mass of the higher animal, its resources, its food, its energy supply, its tissues, serve to overcome and offset the complexity of the structure and the isolation from the outside. An organization is not, like an animal, an end in itself, and successful by the mere act of perpetuating the species. An organization is an organ of society and fulfills itself by the contribution it makes to the outside environment, and yet, the bigger and apparently more successful an organization gets to be, the more will inside events tend to engage the interests, the energies, and the abilities of the executive to the exclusion of his real tasks and his real effectiveness in the outside. This danger is being aggravated today by the advent of the computer and of the new information technology. The computer, being a mechanical moron, can handle only quantifiable data. These it can handle with speed, accuracy, and precision. It will therefore grind out hitherto unobtainable quantified information in large volume. One can, however, by and large quantify only what goes on inside an organization, costs and production figures, patient statistics in the hospital, or training reports. The relevant outside events are rarely available in quantifiable form until it's much too late to do anything about them. This isn't because our information gathering capacity in respect to the outside events lags behind the technical abilities of the computer. If this were the only thing to worry about, we would just have to increase statistical efforts, and the computer itself could greatly help us to overcome this mechanical limitation. The problem is rather that the important and relevant outside events are often qualitative and not capable of quantification. They're not yet facts. For a fact, after all, is an event which somebody has defined, has classified, and above all, has endowed with relevance. To be able to quantify, one has to have a concept first. One first has to abstract from the infinite welter of phenomena a specific aspect which one can then name and finally count. The thalidomide tragedy which led to the birth of so many deformed babies is a case in point. By the time doctors on the European continent had enough statistics to realize that the number of deformed babies born was significantly larger than normal, so much larger that there had to be a specific and new cause, the damage had been done. In the United States, the damage was prevented because one public health physician perceived a qualitative change, a minor and by itself meaningless skin tingling caused by the drug, related it to a totally different event that happened many years earlier, and sounded the alarm before thalidomide actually came into use. The Ford Edsel holds a similar lesson. All the quantitative figures that could possibly be obtained were gathered before the Edsel was launched. All of them pointed to its being the right car for the right market. The qualitative change, the shifting of American consumer buying of automobiles from income-determined to taste-determined market segmentation, no statistical study could possibly have shown. By the time this could be captured in numbers, it was too late. The Edsel had been brought out and had failed. The truly important events on the outside aren't the trends. They're changes in the trends. These determine ultimately success or failure of an organization and its efforts. Such changes, however, have to be perceived. They can't be counted, defined, or classified. The classifications still produce the expected figures as they did for Edsel, but the figures no longer correspond to actual behavior. The computer is a logic machine, and that's its strength, but also its limitation. The important events on the outside can't be reported in the kind of form a computer or any other logic system could possibly handle. Man, however, while not particularly logical, is perceptive, and that's his strength. The danger is that executives will become contemptuous of information and stimulus that can't be reduced to computer logic and computer language. Executives may become blind to everything that is perception, i.e. event, rather than fact, i.e. after the event. The tremendous amount of computer information may thus shut out access to reality. Eventually, the computer, potentially by far the most useful management tool, should make executives aware of their insulation and free them for more time on the outside. In the short run, however, there's danger of acute computeritis. It's a serious affliction. The computer only makes visible a condition that existed before it. Executives of necessity live and work within an organization. Unless they make conscious efforts to perceive the outside, the inside may blind them to the true reality. These four realities the executive can't change. They're necessary conditions of his existence, but he must therefore assume that he'll be ineffectual unless he makes special efforts to learn to be effective. The promise of effectiveness. Increasing effectiveness may well be the only area where we can hope significantly to raise the level of executive performance, achievement, and satisfaction. We certainly could use people of much greater abilities in many places. We could use people of broader knowledge. I submit, however, that in these two areas, not too much can be expected from further efforts. We may be getting to the point where we're already attempting to do the inherently impossible, or at least the inherently unprofitable, but we're not going to breed a new race of supermen. We'll have to run our organizations with men as they are. The books on manager development, for instance, envisage truly a man for all seasons in their picture of the manager of tomorrow. A senior executive, we're told, should have extraordinary abilities as an analyst and as a decision-maker. He should be good at working with people and at understanding organization and power relations, be good at mathematics, and have artistic insights and creative imagination. What seems to be wanted is universal genius, and universal genius has always been in scarce supply. The experience of the human race indicates strongly that the only person in abundant supply is the universal incompetent. We'll therefore have to staff our organizations with people who at best excel in one of these abilities, and then they're more likely to lack any but the most modest endowment in the others. We'll have to learn to build organizations in such a manner that any man who has strength in one important area is capable of putting it to work, as will be discussed in considerable depth in Chapter 4. But we cannot expect to get the executive performance we need by raising our standards for abilities, let alone by hoping for the universally gifted man. We'll have to extend the range of human beings through the tools they have to work with, rather than through a sudden quantum jump in human ability. The same more or less applies to knowledge. However badly we may need people of more and better knowledge, the effort needed to make the major improvement may well be greater than any possible, let alone any probable return. 15 years ago, when operations research first came in, several of the brilliant young practitioners published their prescription for the operations researcher of tomorrow. They always came out asking for a polymath, knowing everything and capable of doing superior and original work in every area of human knowledge. According to one of these studies, operations researchers needed to have advanced knowledge in 62 or so major scientific and humanistic disciplines. If such a man could be found, he would, I am afraid, be totally wasted on studies of inventory levels or on the programming of production schedules. Much less ambitious programs for manager development call for high knowledge in such a host of divergent skills as accounting and personnel, marketing, pricing, and economic analysis, the behavioral sciences such as psychology, and the natural sciences from physics to biology and geology, and we surely need men who understand the dynamics of modern technology, the complexity of the modern world economy, and the labyrinth of modern government. Every one of these is a big area, is indeed too big even for men who work on nothing else. The scholars tend to specialize in fairly small segments of each of these fields, and don't pretend to have more than a journeyman's knowledge of the field itself. I'm not saying that one need not try to understand the fundamentals of every one of these areas. One of the weaknesses of young, highly educated people today, whether in business, medicine, or government, is that they're satisfied to be versed in one narrow specialty and affect a contempt for the other areas. One need not know in detail what to do with human relations as an accountant or how to promote a new branded product if an engineer, but one has a responsibility to know at least what these areas are about, why they're around, and what they're trying to do. One need not know psychiatry to be a good urologist, but one had better know what psychiatry is all about. One need not be an international lawyer to do a good job in the Department of Agriculture, but one had better know enough about international politics not to do international damage through a parochial farm policy. This, however, is something very different from the universal expert, who is as unlikely to occur as the universal genius. Instead, we'll have to learn how to make better use of people who are good in any one of these areas, but this means increasing effectiveness. If one cannot increase the supply of a resource, one must increase its yield, and effectiveness is the one tool to make the resources of ability and knowledge yield more and better results. Effectiveness thus deserves higher priority because of the needs of organization. It deserves even greater priority as the tool of the executive and as his access to achievement and performance. But can effectiveness be learned? If effectiveness were a gift people were born with, the way they're born with a gift for music or an eye for painting, we'd be in bad shape, for we know that only a small minority is born with great gifts in any one of these areas. We'd therefore be reduced to trying to spot people with high potential of effectiveness early and to train them as best we know to develop their talent, but we could hardly hope to find enough people for the executive tasks of modern society this way. Indeed, if effectiveness were a gift, our present civilization would be highly vulnerable if not untenable. As a civilization of large organizations, it's dependent on a large supply of people capable of being executives with a modicum of effectiveness. If effectiveness can be learned, however, the questions arise, what does it consist in? What does one have to learn? Of what kind is the learning? Is it a knowledge, and knowledge one learns in systematic form and through concepts? Is it a skill which one learns as an apprentice, or is it a practice which one learns through doing the same elementary things over and over again? I've been asking these questions for a good many years. As a consultant, I work with executives in many organizations. Effectiveness is crucial to me in two ways. First, a consultant who by definition has no authority other than that of knowledge must himself be effective, or else he's nothing. Second, the most effective consultant depends on people within the client organization to get anything done. Their effectiveness therefore determines in the last analysis whether a consultant contributes and achieves results, or whether he's pure cost center or at best a court jester. I soon learned that there's no effective personality. The effective executives I've seen differ widely in their temperaments and their abilities, in what they do and how they do it, in their personalities, their knowledge, their interests, in fact, in almost everything that distinguishes human beings. All they have in common is the ability to get the right things done. Among the effective executives I've known and worked with, there are extroverts and aloof, retiring men, some even morbidly shy. Some are eccentrics, others painfully correct conformists. Some are fat and some are lean. Some are worriers, some are relaxed. Some drink quite heavily, others are total abstainers. Some are men of great charm and warmth, some have no more personality than a frozen mackerel. There are a few men among them who would answer to the popular conception of a leader, but equally there are colorless men who would attract no attention in a crowd. Some are scholars and serious students, others almost unlettered. Some have broad interests, others know nothing except their own narrow area and care for little else. Some of the men are self-centered, if not indeed selfish, but there are also some who are generous of heart and mind. There are men who live only for their work, and others whose main interests lie outside, in community work, in their church, in the study of Chinese poetry, or in modern music. Among the effective executives I've met, there are people who use logic and analysis, and others who rely mainly on perception and intuition. There are men who make decisions easily, and men who suffer agonies every time they have to move. Effective executives, in other words, differ as widely as physicians, high school teachers, or violinists. They differ as widely as do ineffectual ones, are indeed indistinguishable from ineffectual executives in type, personality, and talents. What all these effective executives have in common is the practices that make effective whatever they have and whatever they are, and these practices are the same whether the effective executive works in a business or in a government agency, as hospital administrator or as university dean. But whenever I've found a man, no matter how great his intelligence, his industry, his imagination, or his knowledge, who fails to observe these practices, I've also found an executive deficient in effectiveness. Effectiveness, in other words, is a habit, that is, a complex of practices, and practices can always be learned. Practices are simple, deceptively so. Even a 7-year-old has no difficulty in understanding a practice, but practices are always exceedingly hard to do well. They have to be acquired, as we all learn the multiplication table, that is, repeated ad nauseum until 6 times 6 equals 36 has become unthinking, conditioned reflex and firmly ingrained habit. Practices one learns by practicing and practicing and practicing again. To every practice applies what my old piano teacher said to me in exasperation when I was a small boy. You will never play Mozart the way Arthur Schnabel does, but there is no reason in the world why you should not play your scales the way he does. What the piano teacher forgot to add, probably because it was so obvious to her, is that even the great pianists could not play Mozart as they do unless they practiced their scales and kept on practicing them. There is, in other words, no reason why anyone with normal endowment shouldn't acquire competence in any practice. Mastery might well elude him, for this one might need special talents, but what is needed in effectiveness is competence. What is needed are the scales. Let me share with you essentially 5 such practices, 5 such habits of the mind that have to be acquired to be an effective executive. 1. Effective executives know where their time goes. They work systematically at managing the little of their time that can be brought under their control. 2. Effective executives focus on outward contribution. They gear their efforts to results rather than to work. They start out with the question, what results are expected of me, rather than with the work to be done, let alone with its techniques and tools. 3. Effective executives build on strengths, their own strengths, the strengths of their superiors, colleagues, and subordinates, and on the strengths in the situation, that is, on what they can do. They don't build on weakness. They don't start out with the things they can't do. 4. Effective executives concentrate on the few major areas where superior performance will produce outstanding results. They force themselves to set priorities and stay with their priority decisions. They know that they have no choice but to do first things first, and second things not at all. The alternative is to get nothing done. And 5. Effective executives finally make effective decisions. They know that this is, above all, a matter of system, of the right steps in the right sequence. They know that an effective decision is always a judgment based on dissenting opinions rather than on consensus on the facts, and they know that to make many decisions fast means to make the wrong decisions. What's needed are few but fundamental decisions. What's needed is the right strategy rather than razzle-dazzle tactics. These are the elements of executive effectiveness, and these are the subjects of this audiobook.